What's up, DE students? Mr. Martinez here again, and this is History Talks. Oh God, it happened, didn't it? We're fighting, aren't we? It started, folks, Civil War time. Officially starting the bloodiest conflict that has ever happened in American history. We're talking about the time period of 1861 to 1865 today. And as you guys can see from my images here, there's a lot of things going on. Now, this episode is going to only focus on a brief overview of the Civil War, as there are so many things that go on in it. But we're just going to look at a brief overview of a few things. Let's go ahead and take a look at what those few things are. If you take a look, our objectives are the northern assets and liabilities versus the southern assets and liabilities, meaning the advantages and disadvantages both of the North and the South had at this time. We're going to talk about the conduct of the war, more importantly, the military strategies, tactics and technology that is used during this time to be able to win the war. You're also going to learn about a bold move of something called the Emancipation Proclamation done by Abraham Lincoln. And we'll even focus on Abraham Lincoln a little bit more and his role as a wartime president. Overall, our essential question for this episode is, why are entrenched beliefs hard to reconcile? Really looking at the perspectives of this war, you can really understand that this question hits a little different. The North clearly sees the South as traitors, and the South looks at this war eventually as merely as the second Declaration of Independence, the second fight for liberty and freedom to do what one wants to do. That's the differences in these entrenched beliefs that people are now willing to fight and die for. But let's get started on learning about some of the overview of this war. We're going to start with the secession and the beginning initial moves that happened in this war. And one thing that we're going to talk about are the initial people who pull the Civil War. We're going to start talking about a group of people called fire eaters, which is the growing population of politicians and some citizens who start to claim that our country really can't get along and that we should just split from one another. And they place the blame not at Abraham Lincoln just yet, but more so at the former presidency with Buchanan, and starting to talk about how all of those crazy things that happened just proves that we should be two countries. It isn't until when Lincoln is our 16th president in November where we start to see the final break. In December 20th, South Carolina secedes from the Union, and soon 6 more states will follow. We've talked about how this is such a controversial thing, and if it was legally even allowed to happen. And even back then, they were also having the same controversial conversation if this is even possible. Our former president Buchanan said states have no right to secede, but Fed government doesn't have a right to stop them. So this idea that they don't have a right to do it, but we also don't have a right to stop them from doing it. While he had this opinion, clearly Abraham Lincoln thought it was completely illegal, not able to happen, and would be damaging for our democracy, as there's no way to hold on to it if we would all just split like this. Now, regardless of Lincoln's opinions, the Confederate States of America are formed in February of 1861 after Texas seceded from the Union. And you start to see the initial land grabs to be able to get in the best strategic position for this war. You start to see forts that are either occupied or abandoned starting to be taken by the South in trying to get those defensive positions and to also gain more war resources from those forts. One of the most notable forts that happen at this time is going to be Fort Sumter, which is the beginning of the Civil War, or given credit for it. But not initially, because for Lincoln, this is a really dicey place. He can't just initially start shooting and attacking these Americans, especially when he's trying to reconcile with how to bring them back. And of course, this would go against all of the promises he made in his inaugural address, where he said that his position is only to hold, occupy, and possess the federal property from the South, meaning that he was not going to take an offensive position, but a defensive position. But regardless of that, he eventually gives in on April 9th when he clearly sees that ships are taking these resources from the forts and are going to be used in the war. So the attacks begin. And we finally see the battles and the war start. Now, fun note, as you see my images right here, many of us in our modern times think of the Confederacy as that first one with the stars and banners, but that is technically not true. That's just the Alabama state flag. What the actual flag is the one that's right above it. That is technically the Confederate flag. But let's go ahead and continue. So, the layout of the Civil War. Let's go ahead and talk about that real quick. As you see from my images, it is clear who's on whose side, but there is a group of people called the border slave states that are going to be the buffer zone between the two countries. And these slave states are going to remain with the Union. They did not join the secession. These are states that are like Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and even West Virginia. They see the South as the real aggressors during this war. And even though they identify more Southerner than Northerner, they're going to stay with the country. And talking about the North, let's talk about some of the advantages they have. One of them clearly being their population is twice the size of the South. They're clearly bigger. And they're more advanced when it comes to industry and factories. We've already mentioned how the North had industrialized way earlier than the South. And that's definitely going to be a big advantage for the North, as they're able to manufacture and produce weapons to be able to support the war and create new innovations too with technology. They also have the economic powerhouse behind them. The United States has tons of money at this time and are able to fund lots of these programs, like, for example, the transportation system. We've talked about railroads before, and they're going to be super important during the Civil War as the North doubles down their investment on railroads, as they know that this is going to be very important. Now, for the Southerners, they have some advantages. If you're looking at my image right now in the top right, you're going to see all the different battle sites. And initially, they start taking place more so towards Virginia, but eventually it starts happening more in the Southern territory. But this is actually an advantage for the South, as they have home field advantage. They know the geography in their territory, and they use it well when they defend against the waves of Northerners that come through. And they have really strong defensive positions that that allows them to be able to withstand a lot of these, and gives lots of power to these Southerner officers that are eventually known for their defending, like Stonewall Jackson. The other advantages is that they eventually get full support from Southerners. Many Southerners will see this, like I mentioned, as the next Declaration of Independence, and eventually with Southern propaganda start to believe that more to be true rather than the real reason for the Civil War. And this is all going to help them as they gain that support. Of course, they didn't get the support from the border states, but with who has joined the South, they have that support. Let's do a quick checkpoint real quick. Based on the North and South advantages listed, which side do you think has the upper hand? And I explain why. Obviously, you know how this war ends, but don't think about that. If you had to just look at the initial advantages, who would you say has that upper hand? Explain that real quick before we continue. Well done. Let's move on, shall we? Let's talk now about the mobilization of the North, and we're going to focus more on the economic measures in this slide, okay? So how do you fund this war? Well, for the North, they're going to be able to pass a lot of laws that are able to fund it, simply also because of how virtually unchallenged they are on the floor. Many citizens and other politicians are giving faith into this political party, into leading this country to victory. And one of the laws that are passed is the Homestead Act of 1862. These are ways to fund the war and gain the confidence from the public into believing in the federal government. For the longest time, acquiring property for Americans was difficult. It was only meant for the wealthy. But at this time, the North opens it up to a new demographics with the Homestead Act, as they start to tell citizens that you are able to move west, and if you can find land that is not occupied, you can claim 160 acres of it. You can live there for 5 years. And in 5 years, if you can prove to the government that you made this plot of land profitable or you bettered it, then you can purchase it from the government. This is a big deal for our country, as this brings in lots of money. Other land grants that are similar to that do the same, where they take a lot of this unincorporated territory, give it to the federal government, and the federal government starts putting price tags on it to be able to sell it. This and also the small income tax are able to support the war bill that comes. The small income tax was able to pay for 2/3 of the war on its own. So with the development of the railroad system and with these laws, they all support the war effort. And another thing that we'll mention is the printed money that starts to come out during the Civil War, which are called greenbacks. These you might be familiar with just because they might be in your pocket. These are the typical dollar bills that we know that are green, that start to be the new form of currency that is adopted at this time. And the value of this new money will fluctuate depending on the success of the war. If the North is winning their battles, the income of that, or the value of that money, increases. And if they're losing, it starts to diminish. So these are a few different initiatives that are pushed to mobilize the North. Now, talking about the military side, here are a few different ways that our country tries to bolster for this war. We have a bit of an issue. We have to raise many of these armies from scratch. At the end of this war, we have about 2 million soldiers that serve. But in the beginning, we only have 16,000 soldiers standing, and most of them are in the West patrolling and defending against rebellions and indigenous tribes. So there's not that many soldiers for this war. So our country has to be innovative with how we acquire more soldiers. So in 1863, Congress forced to implement the draft law to be able to bring in more enlistments for the war. And this draft has some positive and negative consequences to it. One of them is the fact that it actually brings in more volunteers. How? Well, at the time, people could buy out of being in the draft by spending $300 or being able to send someone to represent you in that position of enlistment, either being a slave of yours or even a person of your family. And we were able to get 46,000 people drafted this way, but more people are going to volunteer as there's better incentive programs for people who enlist by volunteering rather than to be drafted. So people go for the benefits rather than being forced to go serve the country against their own will. The negative consequence, though, is going to be the draft riots. There's going to be a growing population of hate crimes that happen during this time because of the draft. The people who are doing these hate crimes is a population of Irish immigrants. At this time, there is a huge rush of Irish immigrants who are coming to America. And Congress finds another way to bring in soldiers by immediately conscripting these immigrants to the military by either conscription or by volunteering them into it. And this angers some Irish immigrants, and they act out their hate towards African Americans as they believe that they're the problem for this whole war. And this will lead to lynching and the burning of African American homes, and even the destroying of an orphanage that housed Black children. Well, with all of these issues that were happening domestically, it doesn't stop Lincoln for what he needs to get done. And he starts to embrace a more centralized authority role and starts to use executive powers and war powers to be able to increase this army size and to be able to send troops into battle without a declaration of war. And he was able to use these war powers to stabilize some of the domestic issues. He even uses these powers to arrest some of those peace Democrats or Copperheads to be able to stop them from disrupting public opinion. Now, talking politics when it comes to the North, one thing we're going to definitely focus on is the politics of the Emancipation Proclamation. This is the big move from Lincoln, where he declared slaves to be free in parts of the Confederacy that were in a rebellion. So freeing the population of the enslaved in the rebellion territory. Now, this isn't an original idea of his. It's actually been an evolution within this emancipation idea. The initial works were by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner and other politicians that wanted to use the war as a way to definitely abolish slavery, but also have the freed slaves help win the war at the same time. So some laws are pushed, like the Confiscation Act, which pretty much took any slaves that were used on the Confederate side to free them and to bring them into the northern side. And also doing this later to more widespread freeing slaves, with the Emancipation being that general call to freeing slaves, with the Emancipation being that general call to freeing the enslaved. Interesting note, though, is he makes this declaration to free the enslaved in the Southern rebellion territories, but not the slave states that are still in the Union, on the border states. Those ones you will still see people enslaved. But this is a huge move, as it really disrupts the South and really changes the game and the tide of war on the strength of these two countries. Another group that's going to be embraced during the Civil War is going to be women and the nursing field and other support realms that women play during this war. The U.S. Sanitary Commission helped turn nursing into a female-dominant profession, though at this time of cult of domesticity code that women had to follow, nursing starts to be a new avenue of opportunity, as these women really try to keep these soldiers on the battlefield as long as they can. Now, there is going to be some pushback. Male doctors are going to try to complain about it, disagree with the idea of women being in the medical profession, but they are completely ignored for the fact that there are too many injured and not enough medical professionals to get to them. So you start to see women accepted into this professional field for the first time. Let's do a quick checkpoint on that, though. How would you describe Lincoln's strategy with the Emancipation Proclamation? Answer that for me real quick before we continue. Well done. Now let's go ahead and talk about the mobilization with the South, and more so the politics, which this slide is all going to represent. Now, interesting note is the Confederate Constitution was a big copy and paste from the US Constitution. It is near identical to the US Constitution, besides emphasizing sovereignty of states and also making sure that the abolition of slavery could never happen. It is impossible for slaves to be free in this country. Those two things were made true in their Constitution, but it is pretty much the same as ours. The president of the Confederate States of America was Jefferson Davis, and the VP was Alexander Stephens. Both were considered moderates before they switched to the Confederacy. Davis, though, wanted to strategize and make and control all the military decisions personally. He saw how Lincoln was centralizing his authority, and he was trying to match that with his. But he's not able to pull it off and be as efficient as how Lincoln was with his execution. And maybe one of those things that was the biggest issue for him to do that is the division that was among the Southern politicians. They were also divided within their own house. That was similar to how our Congress was for ours, where Southerner politicians disagreed on parts of the secession and also on the direction of the war. Now, let's talk about the finances of the Confederacy. And while we talk about this, please note the image on the right-hand side that gives you a good visualization of these two countries and seeing the differences in their finances and agriculture and industry. And you kind of get a better idea of the differences. But for the Confederacy, they had to finance this war too, and they do this primarily through printing money. Now, the issue with this is that they have a difficult time creating a national currency. So instead of having a national currency that everyone uses in the Confederacy, they have all these local and state currencies that are issued. And this creates tons of chaos and confusion among Confederates on the values of all these different currencies, and actually creates tons of inflation. It actually raises the price of things in the Confederacy by 9,000. And it crushes the Southern public morale of the confidence of this new country to be able to stabilize and to govern. Now, at the same time, the North has their value and inflation increased too by 80%, the inflation being not nearly as high as the South. But one of the big things that the South have when it comes to the world of finances is something called cotton diplomacy. This is going to be a big deal, as this is one of the big cards the South believes they have to be able to win this war. Now, what cotton diplomacy is a diplomatic method where the South hoped its economic exporting power of tobacco and cotton would help finance the war and to gain foreign support. So they're hoping that they are able to gain friends in other countries to be able to support their war by constantly continuing their trade and getting those alliances. This is what they're hoping to do with the power of their trade. And the way they do this is they go to countries and they will say, hey, you should support this and be our ally. And if you don't, we will cut you off from our trade. We're going to see if that worked out well for them during this war. But let's talk military real quick with the South and the things they had going for them. When it comes to the South, they also had to do the draft. They also drafted, but it was a little bit different on who was selected. It seems like more poor Southerners will join the enlistment. And with this, the reason why is because they're not able to pay the substitution policy to be able to get out of the war. They either in the South could pay out, or you send your slave in your place to be able to go fight the war. And a lot of these poorer Southerners are found themselves in a position where they're forced into this war, if they like it or not, and they don't have the same confidence. And there is some opposition from some of these poor Southerners. This will result to a big desertion that happens within the South. Desertion is when a soldier runs away from the battlefield, gives up on the military, and no longer wants to serve it. And by 1865, there were over 100,000 desertions, as a lot of these poor Southerners were no longer feeling like they were benefiting from this war, that they started to see it almost getting into a class war of why are the poor Southerners having to go fight this war while the plantation owners are the ones who potentially started this war in the name of slavery, of defending it. So you start to see a big desertion. And another credit for the desertion too is a lot of Confederate women encouraged Confederate soldiers to give up. There's tons of letters and records that are out there where you see Confederate women beg their partners or husbands to give up on this cause in this country and just to come back home. And this is also going to have a huge impact on the military when it comes to the Confederacy. But as you see on the image on the right-hand side, the Confederacy still gains soldiers, though we don't know their full records of demographics since they destroyed them. We do know the civilian occupation. And if you look at the strengths, you can see the enlistment of the Confederacy dwindles as the Union continuously increases. One thing, though, that the South has that the North doesn't for a while is strong military leadership. And none other is more recognizable than Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general that has a strong um, lift or influence on the battlefield. Now, Robert E. Lee is the commander of the Confederate Army. He's the ultimate general, and his name has weight. There's a reputation behind him. He's known for being a skilled strategist, really good on the battlefield. He's known for the way he can inspire soldiers to fight until the last end, to get all out of them. And he is known to be respected among all of his soldiers and officers. And he is deeply feared by the Union Army, deeply feared, and also the Northern public too. Robert E. Lee, when he did his campaign of marching towards Washington, D.C., trying to make it to the Capitol, when the news came out in the North that Robert E. Lee was coming to Washington, D.C., the citizens in Washington, D.C. started to evacuate. They gave up, for some of them, and just thinking that if Robert E. Lee's coming, then we got to get the heck out of here. There's nothing that could stop him. There was that level of hysteria behind this man's name, as he was definitely an opponent for the Northerners. But let's go ahead and answer this checkpoint real quick. What are some observations / facts that can be drawn out of the statistic images that you just saw? Out of the 3 that you saw, what are some things that you can draw out when you do that visualization of all the data? Answer that real quick before we continue. All right, good job. Let's go ahead and move on, shall we? So let's talk strategy now, okay? We saw them be mobilized. We're seeing the different elements to being able to fight a war. What's the strategy? Well, let's talk about the North strategy real quick. First off, Lincoln does not have a fun time in the beginning of this war. The beginning of the war almost looks like the South is going to win or is winning. There's a lot of lost battles, and Lincoln cannot match the military leadership from the South. And he has to go through a lot of replacements of generals until he gets one that he is confident in. With Winfield Scott, a known general retiring in 1861, Lincoln had to appoint different kinds of generals, one being George McClellan, which was a general that did not work for Lincoln. He thought he was arrogant. They disagreed. He wasn't effective. And he fires McClellan. And eventually McClellan tries to run against Lincoln as president in the next election in 1864. But eventually, Lincoln finds a general that he has confidence in, which is Ulysses Grant, another known general, but for the North. And he's going to be a strong opponent for the South. But before Winfield Scott retired, he did give a good strategy for Lincoln. And what that is the Anaconda Plan. The Anaconda Plan is a naval blockade that began in 1861. It's the image that you see on my screen right there. And it's simply a strategy of isolating your enemy. What we did was we created a naval blockade all around the South, and we isolated them from the 2 things that were vital to them. If the South is to be strengthened by trade and possibly alliances, then they need to be cut off from both. And that's what this idea was. And when eventually the North starts to take control of the Mississippi River, you start to see that we complete the circle of isolation, which holds them into starving out eventually or withering away. This is going to be a big deal. But for the South, they try to still get away around this. Let's go ahead and talk about that South strategy. So the blockade exists, but the South is determined to break it. And they start to become innovative with how they're going to try to break and disrupt this blockade. They create these crazy ships that are called the ironclads. And if you're looking at my images here, you'll know why I say they're crazy. Half submerged, half merged boats that are made mostly out of metal. These first metal battleships that are going to be used on the coast. And you're going to see that there's a lot of famous battles that happen as the Union also creates their ironclads and these big matches that will happen in the Atlantic Ocean. Eventually, the North still holds the blockade, regardless of these metal contraptions the South makes. But the South is determined to try to make communication with somebody. And they're trying to reach out to England and France to see if they can gain support from them. Interesting to know that England and France did have some sympathy for the South, more so England. I don't know why, but England, either for revenge or for whatever, were inclined to listen to the South a little bit. And they were reluctant to join the war, but they were interested in hearing out the South. The South used their cotton diplomacy on them, saying that you should join us and we can continue trading. If you don't join us, then we're cutting you off. And they were hoping that England would be leveraged into joining them. But it didn't work. England at this time had a surplus of cotton. They had so much of it at their place that they were even trying to sell it off to England and Egypt. So it didn't have that value that the South had. So England did not support the South at the extent that the South wanted. There's even other lines of communication that happens between the South and foreign countries or foreign places. For example, the Pope at this time has exchanged letters with the South, with Jefferson Davis. And in these letters between the Pope and Jefferson Davis, Pope is trying to find a way to give sympathy or to help out the South, but was hoping that the South would be reflective on that, knowing that slavery was bad. And the South, when hearing the Pope talk about this, merely say that if you're against slavery, don't be too quick to point the finger at me, as the finger should be pointed at you as much as Europeans were the ones who initiated the slavery, and we just continued it when you brought it to the continent. So they were saying, don't point the finger too far from yourself. And it didn't go that far. The one development that happened with these communications was the Trent Affair, though, which was when two Confederate diplomats tried to escape the blockade and jump on a British steamer, but Northerner men stopped them and arrested those diplomats. And this is when the North is now aware of the South's intentions of trying to gain allegiances and alliances. And this creates a lot of tension between Lincoln and England. Even some forms of threats of our country telling these countries to stay away from our domestic issues unless we're going to have problems. Eventually, the Confederates do get some support from Great Britain in buying some materials and ships. Later, United States will condemn this and even force Great Britain to pay reparations for antagonizing the war further. Let's go ahead and do this next checkpoint real quick. Describe both the North and the South's general strategy for victory. What were the general strategies of these two countries and the moves they were trying to make? Answer that real quick. Well done. Good job. Now, the war is here. There is so much that happens in this war. Though it is just a few years long, there are so many battles that are notable. And we could be here all day long having a conversation about all of these. But I figure you don't want to hear that much, nor do I want to go through them all in that same kind of way. So instead of you hearing Martinez talk about all of these key moments in the war, I would rather you spend some time to watch this really great video that captures this war extremely well and gives you a broad understanding of the magnitude of it. I will admit the video is a little bit long, but I would love for you to watch it as much as you can or far as you enjoy it. And once you're at a limit, then go ahead and stop. But I would challenge you to try to watch the full video as you get the full grasp of this war. Watch it now if you can. Good job. And thank you for watching that. And as you can see, at the end of this civil war, there is so much that still needs to be solved for this country. As it's one thing to declare war and to fight, it's another to rebuild. And it is going to be difficult for our country to rebuild when we are feeling leaderless. Abraham Lincoln on April 14th, 1865, will be assassinated at Ford's Theater, leaving our country aimless with the direction of rebuilding the Union and putting back together this country. But that'll be for another episode to see how the efforts of Reconstruction go for this country. What I would rather us focus on are some of the last reflections of this war. Overall, at the end, there are 600,000 American lives that will be lost, this making it the highest casualty war that America has ever been in. And with the death, the destruction, and the lives lost, there's some reflective questions we would want to think about. The lessons that we can take away from this war and civil wars, the obstacles that our country will still face as we rebuild it, what those may be, and also what does this mean for those recently freed slaves? Are they to be freed and are on their own to figure out what to do from here on? Are they to be supported and protected from the government so that they are able to succeed and be safe? What is the next moves? These are things that we do need to talk about in our next episode with Reconstruction. But for now, that is all I have for you folks. This was a long episode. It took a lot out of me. I don't know about you, but doing these history talks takes a lot. You know what? Maybe you should try history talk for once. That's right, folks. Then we'll give you a little announcement. In this week, you will make a history talk episode. That's right. We're going to do a mini series where you get to pick a topic within the Civil War, and you have to do something called a history talk mini on that topic. So this time you get to be the one that teaches. I'd like to see you teach. So until then, folks, I will give you more on that information, but congratulations for finishing this episode and going through the entirety of it. I really appreciate it, and I really do hope you learned something new from it. But until then, that is it for me, folks. Thank you so much. I'm Mr. Martinez, and I am signing out. I will see you next time.